At first, everybody thought that this was just a tragic car accident. 3 teenagers, a speeding crash, 2 deaths, and then investigators uncover threats, toxic fights, surveillance footage, and one chilling accusation that this wasn't reckless driving at all and this was murder. Hi friends, how are we doing today? I hope you're all doing very well. I hope you're staying safe, drinking your water, minding your business, all of those things. Today we're talking about a case that has completely divided the internet. Like, people are passionately arguing over this one. Some people believe that this was a horrible accident. Other people believe that this was intentional murder. And honestly, once you get into the details, the social media posts, the relationship drama, the courtroom footage, the threats, all of it, it starts feeling less like a tragic crash and more like a disaster waiting to happen. So let's go ahead and talk about McKenzie Shirilla. So before we get into it, I need you to picture this for a second. You're 18 or 19 years old. It's summer after graduation. Your whole life feels huge. Everything is exciting. You're hanging out with your friends every night. You're staying out too late, doing reckless teenager things because your brain hasn't fully developed and you somehow think that you're invincible. Suddenly, everybody in your town wakes up to news that 3 teenagers were involved in one of the most horrific crashes that anyone had seen. Not just a bad crash either, a nightmare crash. The kind that first responders never forget. That happened in Strongsville, Ohio during the early morning hours of July 31st, 2022. Strongsville is one of those suburban communities outside Cleveland where everybody seems connected somehow. Kids grow up together, parents know each other, news travels fast, and on that morning, the entire town was shaken by what had happened on Alameda Drive. 3 young people were inside a Toyota Camry, 19-year-old Davion Flanagan, 20-year-old Dominic Russo, and 17-year-old McKenzie Shirilla, who was driving the car. At approximately 5:30 in the morning, the Camry slammed into a commercial building at an absolutely insane speed. The impact was so violent that the car practically split apart. Pieces of metal were everywhere, the engine separated from the vehicle, and the entire scene looked less like a car accident and more like something out of an explosion movie. What makes this even worse is that nobody immediately found them. About 45 minutes later, a jogger running through the area noticed the wreckage and called 911. And by the time emergency crews arrived, Dominic and Davion were already gone. McKenzie somehow survived, but barely. She was critically injured and airlifted to the hospital while investigators tried to piece together what the hell had just happened. At first, police treated it like a tragic accident. Young people out late, possible speeding, maybe drugs or alcohol. Sadly, these things happen all the time. But almost immediately, rumors started circulating around town that this crash might have not been accidental at all. And once investigators started digging deeper, things got dark really fast. Now, let's talk about the people involved because understanding the relationships here matters a lot. Dominic Russo and McKenzie Shirilla had been dating on and off for quite a while, and apparently the relationship was messy. Like toxic. Constant fighting, breaking up, getting back together, threats, drama, emotional chaos. The kind of relationship where everybody around you is just exhausted from hearing about it. You know those couples where every week everybody posts a cryptic Instagram story and they're like, don't trust anyone, and then 2 days later they're posting kissing selfies again? Yeah, that energy. Anyways, Davion Flanagan was Dominic's close friend, and by all accounts, Davion seemed genuinely loved by everyone around him. He played football, he had plans for the future, he wanted to open a barbershop someday. People described him as kind, loyal, funny, protective, the kind of person that would show up for you no matter what. Which honestly makes everything about this even more heartbreaking because many people believe that Davion was not supposed to die that night. They think that he was simply in the wrong car at the wrong time. According to reports, the 3 of them had spent the night hanging out at a party. There was marijuana involved. Witnesses later said that McKenzie and Dominic offered Davion a ride home, which is pretty normal teenager behavior, honestly. Nothing about that night initially sounded unusual. But investigators quickly started questioning why they were even driving through that industrial area in the first place, because Alameda Drive wasn't near any of their homes. It wasn't even on the route to Davion's house. And surveillance footage would later show something even more chilling. Before the crash, McKenzie had been driving completely normal. She was calm, like controlled, braking correctly, using her turning signals, nothing reckless at all. And then suddenly, after turning onto Alameda Drive, she accelerated hard. The car reached speeds estimated around 100 miles per hour on a regular street in the dark towards a building. And according to crash investigators, there was no evidence of braking at all. None. Which immediately raises the biggest question of the entire case. Why? Police recovered the vehicle's event data recorder, which is basically the car's black box, which shows the accelerator was pressed all the way down seconds before impact. Prosecutors would later argue that this proved intention. The defense argued that it only proved recklessness. But things got worse once investigators started looking into McKenzie and Dominic's relationship history, because apparently there had been previous incidents where McKenzie threatened to crash a car during arguments with Dominic. And not vague threats either, like actual threats. One witness later claimed that during an earlier argument between the couple, McKenzie literally screamed, "I'll crash this car right now." That statement became massively important later because prosecutors argued it showed a pattern, that when McKenzie felt emotionally overwhelmed or rejected, she used threats involving vehicles to scare Dominic. Meanwhile, McKenzie's supporters argued something completely different. They said that, yeah, she was immature, emotional, dramatic, sure, but not a murderer. And honestly, this case became so polarizing because there's evidence people interpret in completely opposite ways. Some people watched the surveillance footage and immediately thought, yeah, she absolutely meant to do this. And then others thought, this looks like a teenager making reckless decisions without understanding consequences. But here's where things started shifting heavily against McKenzie in the court of public opinion. Her social media behavior after the crash. Now look, everybody grieves differently, I fully believe that. Some people isolate, some people joke through trauma, some people post online constantly because they don't know how else to cope. Human beings are weird, grief is weird. But people in Strongsville were horrified by some of McKenzie's behavior after the crash. Screenshots circulated online showing TikToks, Instagram comments, photos, and things that people just thought were insensitive considering two young men had just died. Some classmates described her as selfish and entitled long before the crash even happened. Others claimed that her parents enabled her behavior and never held her accountable for anything. And then came the arrest. On November 4th, 2022, months after the crash, police arrested McKenzie Shirilla and charged her with multiple counts, including murder, aggravated vehicular homicide, felonious assault, and drug-related charges connected to mushrooms inside the car. When body cam footage of the arrest was eventually released, people became even more convinced that she lacked remorse. Because according to many viewers, her biggest concern during the arrest seemed to be protecting her jewelry and bracelets from getting damaged while officers processed her into custody. Not the deaths, not the charges, the bracelets. Now obviously people respond differently under stress. Some people dissociate, some focus on random details because their brain literally cannot process reality yet. But the footage deeply disturbed many people watching it, especially because prosecutors were already building a case arguing that this wasn't an accident at all. They believed McKenzie intentionally drove that car into that building to kill Dominic, and that Davion tragically became collateral damage. Now in this next part, we're going to dive into the trial itself because once prosecutors revealed the surveillance footage, the black box data, the prior threats, and the relationship evidence, this case went from controversial to absolutely explosive. Okay, so where we just left off, prosecutors officially charged McKenzie with murder. And suddenly, this wasn't being treated like a reckless driving case anymore. This was the state of Ohio saying, no, we fully believe that she intentionally killed Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. Which is a huge accusation, because think about it. Prosecutors weren't just arguing that she drove dangerously. They weren't saying that she made one horrible split-second decision. They were arguing that she knowingly and deliberately turned her car into a weapon. And honestly, once the trial started, the evidence they presented made a lot of people physically uncomfortable. Now, before we get into all of that, let's talk about McKenzie herself for a second, because during this entire investigation, there were basically two completely different versions of her floating around online. Now, one version painted her as this deeply troubled, manipulative, entitled girl who exploded emotionally whenever she didn't get her way. The other version painted her as a traumatized teenager who survived a horrific crash, lost her boyfriend and friend, and then became the target of nationwide hatred before she even got the chance to recover. And somewhere in the middle of those two extremes is probably the truth. When the case officially went to court in 2023, prosecutors came prepared. I mean very prepared. McKenzie just turned 18 2 days after the crash happened, but because she had been 17 at the time of the incident, the case originally started in juvenile court. Eventually, though, the judge approved moving her case into adult court because of the severity of the charges. And once that happened, everything became public. People started dissecting every little detail. Court hearings, body language, social media posts, jail calls, literally everything. Now here's something important. McKenzie chose a bench trial instead of a jury trial, meaning that instead of 12 jurors deciding her fate, one judge would hear all the evidence and make the final decision. And people had opinions about that too. Some people believed that the defense worried a jury would emotionally react to the horrific crash footage and instantly convict her. Others thought that a judge might focus more on technical evidence instead of emotion. Either way, the trial officially began on August 7th, 2023, and prosecutors wasted absolutely no time. During opening statements, they told the court that this crash was intentional, purposeful, and planned. Then they introduced one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case: the surveillance footage. Now, multiple cameras from nearby businesses captured portions of McKenzie driving before the crash. One camera showed her driving normally, using her blinker, slowing correctly before turning. Nothing unusual. Then another camera captured the moment that everything changed. The car suddenly accelerated at an extreme speed down the industrial roadway before disappearing from frames moment before impact. And according to crash analysts, the event data recorder showed the accelerator pedal being fully pushed down 100%. No braking, no swerving to avoid impact, nothing. Prosecutors had argued that this proved that she intentionally drove into the building. The defense argued that it only proved recklessness and panic. But then prosecutors introduced something even more damaging: prior threats. Specifically, testimony from Dominic Russo's friend, Christopher Henchmartin. Now, Christopher described a previous argument between McKenzie and Dominic that happened just weeks before the deadly crash. According to him, McKenzie became enraged during a fight while driving and threatened to crash the car. Not metaphorically, literally. He testified that he heard her say, "I'll crash this car right now." Then, according to testimony, Dominic called his mother because he wanted out of the vehicle. Christopher arrived to pick him up and allegedly witnessed McKenzie physically hitting Dominic after the car stopped. Now, this testimony became critical because prosecutors argued it established a pattern. They said that McKenzie used threats involving vehicles as a form of emotional control during conflicts with Dominic. The defense, of course, pushed back hard. They argued that toxic arguments between young couples are unfortunately common and that emotional statements made during fights do not automatically prove future murder. Which is fair, but then prosecutors introduced another incident, and honestly, this one was rough to listen to. They played an audio from a separate confrontation between McKenzie and Dominic, where she repeatedly threatened him outside of his own home. In the recording, Dominic sounded exhausted, like completely emotionally drained. Meanwhile, McKenzie could allegedly be heard demanding he let her inside while threatening to damage his car and property if he refused. At one point, she reportedly said, "You're going to open this door right now or there's going to be a serious problem." And the courtroom apparently became very tense listening to it, because prosecutors argued that the recording demonstrated how McKenzie reacted when she felt rejected, abandoned, or ignored by Dominic. They believed jealousy and fear of losing him motivated the crash. Now, Dominic's mother, Christine Russo, also testified. And honestly, her testimony hit people hard because she spoke about McKenzie almost like somebody grieving two different losses at once. At one point, McKenzie had actually lived with their family temporarily. Christine clearly cared about her once, but during testimony, she described Dominic and McKenzie's relationship as volatile and emotionally exhausting. She also shared a text message that McKenzie had sent her after the crash. In the message, McKenzie claimed that she remembered turning onto the road before everything suddenly went black. She said trauma prevented her from remembering anything else, and she even mentioned wanting hypnosis therapy to recover her memories, which again became another major debate online. Some people believe that memory loss after trauma is completely realistic, and others believe that she was pretending not to remember because remembering would expose intent. And honestly, memory from traumatic brain injuries can absolutely become fragmented. That part alone isn't unusual. I would know because I was in a crash. If you already checked out my crash video, if not, you should go watch that. Anyways, I'm sorry. Prosecutors believed that other evidence outweighed her claimed memory loss. One especially chilling detail involved the route itself. Investigators discovered that there was data placed in McKenzie's phone near the crash location in the days before the incident. Prosecutors argued that this suggested premeditation, that she may have previously scouted the industrial area before carrying out the crash. The defense argued that that was speculation and proved absolutely nothing, which technically they weren't wrong. Being somewhere beforehand does not automatically prove planning, but prosecutors combined that evidence with the threats, the acceleration, the lack of braking, and the relationship turmoil to build their overall narrative. And then came one of the prosecution's strongest emotional moments: the crash footage itself. The judge later described it as impossible to forget. Apparently, the courtroom went silent while watching it because everybody knew exactly what was coming. Two young men were about to die. And according to the prosecution, there was nothing accidental about it. Crash analysts testified that approximately 1 second before impact, the steering wheel sharply turned. And the defense suggested that maybe Dominic or Davion grabbed the wheel. Prosecutors said that there was no evidence supporting that. The defense also suggested that McKenzie may have panicked after airbags deployed moments earlier when the car struck a roadside object before the final impact. Again, though, prosecutors pointed back to the accelerator being fully pressed down over and over and over again. Now, another huge point of controversy involved McKenzie's medical condition. Her mother testified that McKenzie suffered from POTS, a disorder that can cause dizziness and fainting episodes. The defense later leaned heavily into this argument, suggesting that McKenzie may have experienced some kind of blackout or medical emergency while driving. But prosecutors argued that there was no credible evidence a medical event caused the crash. In fact, they pointed out that McKenzie denied having any medical driving limitations when applying for and renewing her license. And honestly, the courtroom became this battle between two completely different stories. Story one was an emotionally unstable teenager intentionally drove into a building after relationship turmoil, and story two was a reckless but traumatized teenager lost control during a tragic accident and became demonized afterwards. Depending on what evidence people focused on most, they came away believing very different things. But the prosecution had one final thing that they kept repeating throughout the trial: intent, because legally that mattered most. Not whether McKenzie was immature, not whether she was toxic, not whether she regretted what happened afterwards. The question was whether she purposely accelerated that vehicle knowing that death would occur. And after 4 intense days of testimony, evidence, and emotional courtroom moments, the judge prepared to deliver a verdict that would completely change Mackenzie Shirilla's life forever. Now, next time we're going to get into the verdict, the sentencing, the victim impact statements, and the absolute jaw-dropping behavior afterwards that made public outrage explode even more. So after 4 days of testimony, emotional courtroom moments, surveillance footage, relationship drama, and enough tension to make everybody in that courtroom probably need a chiropractor afterwards, it was finally time for the judge to decide. And let me tell you something, people were nervous because this case really did split public opinion right down the middle. There were people who fully believed McKenzie Shirilla was a cold, manipulative killer, and then there was the people who thought that prosecutors were taking a tragic teenage crash and forcing it into a murder narrative because the deaths were so horrific. But Judge Nancy Russo, she made it very clear where she stood. On August 4th, 2023, the courtroom filled as everybody waited for the verdict. Dominic Russo's family was there, Davion Flanagan's family was there, Mackenzie's family was there too. And honestly, you could practically feel the anxiety through the screen watching the footage afterwards. Then the judge began speaking, and immediately you could tell that this was not heading in Mackenzie's favor. The judge described the crash footage as haunting. She said it was a type of evidence that you can never unsee. That once you watch it, you already know that you're witnessing the final moments of two people's lives, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Which honestly, chills. Then the judge started going point by point through the evidence. The route, the speed, the acceleration, the lack of braking, the prior threats, the relationship issues, and most importantly, intent. The judge specifically said Mackenzie transformed from a responsible driver into literal hell on wheels. Literal hell on wheels. That phrase immediately exploded online because people were like, wow, okay, she is not holding back at all. The judge said that Mackenzie alone controlled the events of that night. She chose the route, she chose the speed, she chose to press the accelerator fully down, she chose the timing, she chose everything. And according to the judge, the mission was death. Then came the verdicts. Guilty, guilty, and guilty. Again and again and again. Murder charges, felonious assault charges, aggravated vehicular homicide charges. The judge found Mackenzie guilty on all counts. Now, if you watch the courtroom footage, Mackenzie herself stayed fairly expressionless during much of the verdict reading. But behind her, family members became visibly emotional. At one point, she was being escorted away. You could literally hear someone call out, "I love you, baby." Meanwhile, Dominic and Davion's family sat there after hearing a judge officially declare their sons had been intentionally killed. Honestly, there's no winning in a case like this. There just isn't. 2 young men are dead. Another young woman was now convicted of murder before even turning 20 years old. Everybody lost. Now, the sentencing hearing afterward, that's where the emotions absolutely exploded. Because victim impact statements were already heartbreaking under normal circumstances, but hearing parents and siblings describe losing somebody so young is honestly unbearable sometimes. Davion Flanagan's mom spoke first, and her statements destroyed people. She described Davion as somebody who loved deeply and protected others. She talked about how he was adopted along with his siblings from foster care and how he became this incredible source of love and stability for his family. She said that he made people feel seen, valued, safe, which honestly is probably one of the nicest things anyone could say ever about another human being. Then she spoke about his careers too. Barber school, opening his own shop someday, a future that he never got the chance to have. Then Davion's sister spoke. And this part was especially painful because she talked about how much trauma that their family had already survived before losing him too. She described him not just as a brother, but as her protector and comfort person. The one who helped hold everyone together emotionally. And now he was gone forever because somebody made one irreversible decision. Then Then Dominic Russo's family spoke, and honestly, you could hear the anger mixed with the grief in their voices. Dominic's mother talked about how she genuinely once loved McKenzie. She treated her like family at one point, but now her son was dead, and she fully believed that McKenzie intentionally caused it. At one point, she said something that stuck with a lot of people afterwards. She said that she lost 3 children that night. Dominic, Davion, and McKenzie too. Because regardless of what happened, the girl they once knew was gone. Now, while all of this was happening, people online were also becoming increasingly outraged over reports about McKenzie's behavior after the crash. Prosecutors introduced social media videos and evidence that they claimed showed a shocking lack of remorse. There were TikToks, there were concert outings, comments about modeling opportunities, videos that prosecutors argue painted a picture of somebody more focused on herself than this devastation surrounding her. One TikTok in particular drew major backlash because of the lyrics in the background about being the girl that you die for. People lost their minds over that. Now, to be fair, social media timing can sometimes look awful, even when it's not intentional. People schedule posts, friends upload things, teenagers make questionable choices constantly. But prosecutors used all of it to reinforce their argument that McKenzie lacked accountability and empathy. And then came McKenzie's mother. And listen, I try very hard to see nuance in cases because life usually isn't black and white, but even people sympathetic towards McKenzie struggled with her mother's courtroom statement. Because instead of focusing primarily on Dominic and Davion, much of her statement centered around McKenzie being misunderstood and unfairly labeled a murder. She repeatedly called the crash a tragic accident. She described McKenzie crying in bed for months while listening to Dominic's music and looking at his photos. She defended her daughter attending events afterwards by saying that they wanted her to have moments of happiness despite grieving. And at one point, the judge even interrupted her because she kept trying to argue the facts of the case rather than simply just giving a sentencing statement. The judge literally told her, "We do not need 5 minutes to learn who she is and what she's capable of." Which, yikes. Now, whether you agreed with the judge or not, the tension between McKenzie's family and the courtroom was extremely obvious by this point. Then McKenzie herself finally spoke. McKenzie had apologized to the families, and she said that she was deeply sorry. She said that she wished that she could remember what happened and insisted that she never would have intentionally allowed this to occur. She called Dominic her soulmate. She said that she wished she could take everybody's pain away. And honestly, reactions to her statement were mixed too. Some people thought that she sounded sincere. Others thought that it felt rehearsed and detached. Again, this case became one giant argument about perception. Everything she did, every facial expression, every word, every post, every silence, people interpreted it differently depending on what they already believed about her. But the judge remained firm. When delivering the sentence, she once again emphasized that there was no medical emergency proven, no mechanical failure, and no evidence supporting the defense theories enough to outweigh the prosecution's case. She also made another major point. Even if McKenzie intended to die too, that would not erase the murder charges. A failed murder-suicide attempt is still murder. Then finally, the sentence. She sentenced McKenzie 15 years to life in prison, meaning that McKenzie would become eligible for parole in her 30s. And just like that, one of the most controversial true crime cases involving young people in recent years officially closed. Well, sort of. Because after sentencing, the case somehow became even messier. New defense teams, claims about hidden evidence, medical episode theories, released jail calls, public interviews from McKenzie's parents, and honestly, some of those jail calls made people even more convinced that she lacked remorse entirely. Now, in this next part, we're diving into the aftermath, because once those recordings and interviews surfaced, public opinion exploded all over again. Okay, so after McKenzie Shirilla was convicted and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison, you would think maybe things would quiet down a little bit, right? Like the trial happened, the judge made her decision, everybody mourns, everybody processes it, and eventually the public moves on to the next horrifying thing happening in the world, because unfortunately there's always another horrifying thing happening in the world. But no, this case somehow got even messier afterwards, because once the trial ended, McKenzie's legal team immediately started fighting back hard. And honestly, part of the reason this case keeps resurfacing online over and over again is because there are still people who genuinely believe she was wrongfully convicted. Not innocent necessarily, but overcharged. There's a difference. A lot of people believe that she absolutely drove recklessly and caused a crash, but should have never been convicted of murder. They think that aggravated vehicular homicide, sure. Reckless homicide, maybe. But intentional murder, that's where some people feel prosecutors went too far. Meanwhile, other people think that the judge got it exactly right. So let's talk about what happened after sentencing, because this is where the defense started introducing new claims and new evidence. First came the argument about McKenzie's medical condition. Throughout the trial, there have been discussions about POTS, which stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Basically, it's a condition that can cause dizziness, fainting, rapid heartbeat, and blackouts in some people. McKenzie's mother claimed that her daughter suffered from it. The defense later leaned into this much more aggressively after the conviction, arguing that McKenzie may have experienced some type of medical episode while driving. And honestly, if you only had heard that part isolated from everything else, you might think, okay, that sounds possible. But prosecutors pushed back heavily for several reasons. First, there was no concrete evidence of an active medical episode happening during the crash itself. Second, McKenzie had reportedly denied having any medical driving limitations when applying for and renewing her driver's license. And third, probably most importantly, prosecutors argued that the driving behavior simply didn't match somebody suddenly losing consciousness. Because according to crash data, the accelerator stayed fully pressed down. The steering adjusted, the vehicle remained directed towards the building. To prosecutors, this looked deliberate, not random. Still though, McKenzie's new legal team continued building around the medical theory after trial. And then another twist happened. Text messages surfaced. And these texts became a huge discussion online because supporters of McKenzie believed they completely changed the narrative surrounding her relationship with Dominic Russo. Now, one message allegedly sent by McKenzie said something like, "Can you come get Dom? He just grabbed my steering wheel on the highway trying to spin out my car and hurt me." Then later, Dominic reportedly apologized. Now, immediately, people started arguing over what this meant. Supporters said that it proved Dominic could also become volatile and dangerous during arguments. They argued that the relationship toxicity went both ways, and prosecutors unfairly portrayed McKenzie as the sole aggressor. Critics argued that the text changed absolutely nothing because even if Dominic behaved badly at times, it did not justify or explain driving 100 miles per hour into a building weeks later. Which honestly is true. Two toxic people can exist simultaneously. One person behaving badly does not automatically erase another person's actions. But the defense believed that these texts were important enough to pursue post-conviction relief. So on October 2024, McKenzie's attorney officially filed paperwork requesting for a new trial. And here's the wild part. The request got denied because it was filed one day late. One single day. Now, legally speaking, deadlines are deadlines. Courts follow procedural rules constantly, but online, people lost their minds over this because some argued such a serious case deserved flexibility over a 24-hour delay. Others argued that rules exist for a reason and that the defense team simply messed up. Either way, the request was denied. Then came the interviews, and honestly, these interviews may have hurt public sympathy more than it helped it, because up until this point, McKenzie's parents had stayed mostly quiet publicly, but eventually they sat down and started speaking out, insisting that their daughter never intentionally hurt anybody. Her mother became especially vocal. At one point during the interview, she basically challenged people directly, saying, "Show me one piece of evidence that she did this on purpose." And listen, that statement alone tells you how completely opposite the family views this case compared to the judge, because the judge believed almost all of the evidence pointed towards intent. Meanwhile, McKenzie's family seemed to believe that there was no evidence at all. Her parents argued that there were unanswered questions about what had happened inside that vehicle that morning. They suggested that maybe Dominic grabbed the wheel, maybe McKenzie blacked out, maybe panic played a role. They also insisted that McKenzie loved Dominic deeply and would never intentionally kill him. Now, whether you believe them probably depends entirely on how you interpret the crash evidence. But one thing that definitely did not help public perception was the jail calls. Oh boy. In 2025, recorded jail calls between McKenzie and her mother were released publicly, and people immediately started analyzing every word. In one call, McKenzie complained about the prosecution, and she said that she wanted to tell the prosecutor to shut up. In another, she talked about wanting to get out on bond and how unfair everything felt. At one point, she even described herself as the third victim, which caused outrage online because people were like, "Excuse me? 2 people are dead. Families are destroyed forever, and you're calling yourself the victim?" Now, to be fair, surviving traumatic crashes absolutely causes psychological trauma too. Survivors often experience guilt, PTSD, fear, depression, all kinds of things. But the way McKenzie spoke during some of these calls rubbed people the wrong way because They felt that the conversations focused heavily on her suffering rather than the lives lost. There were also discussions during the calls about her medical condition supposedly worsening in jail. McKenzie described blacking out again while incarcerated and insisted that nobody had ever told her POTS could affect her driving. Her mother reassured her repeatedly. And honestly, listening to the calls, you could tell that the family genuinely believes that she's being wrongfully punished. Like, truly. They do not seem to view her as somebody who intentionally murdered anyone. But the public reaction? Completely brutal. Especially because people already viewed McKenzie through the lens of entitlement and lack of accountability. So every interview, every phone call, every public statement just fueled more arguments online. And then there was another thing people could not stop discussing. Remorse, because this became one of the biggest emotional dividing points in the entire case. Supporters argued McKenzie clearly showed grief and trauma after the crash. They pointed to the statements about depression, crying, memory loss, guilt, and emotional breakdowns. Critics argued that her behavior consistently lacked genuine accountability. They point to the social media posts, the jail calls, the focus on herself, and the overall tone surrounding her reactions after the crash. And honestly, remorse is tricky. Some people cry constantly. Some people completely shut down. Some become numb. Some sound detached because their brains literally cannot process reality properly. Human behavior after trauma is not always logical, but unfortunately, perception matters, especially in high-profile cases. And once the internet collectively decides somebody seems cold or selfish, it's almost impossible to undo that image. Meanwhile, Dominic and Davion's families continued grieving publicly. Davion's loved ones spoke often about how deeply his loss affected their family structure. Dominic's family maintained memorials honoring him and continued insisting that justice had been served correctly. And honestly, regardless of what people believe about intent, nobody disputes one thing. The devastation here is enormous. 2 young men with entire futures ahead of them died violently. A teenage girl lost her freedom before adulthood truly even began. Multiple families shattered permanently. And somehow, even years later, people still passionately debate what really happened during those final seconds inside that car. Now, next time we're diving even deeper into the psychology, the public reaction, the Netflix documentary coverage, and why this case continued dividing people so intensely even now. At this point, the McKenzie Shirilla case had basically become internet warfare. I mean, seriously, every single time somebody posted about it online, the comments instantly turn into a battlefield. You have one side screaming that she's a murderer, and then you have another side yelling that she's a traumatized teenager. Then you have a group saying that the relationship was toxic both ways. And somewhere buried in the middle were people just devastated for Dominic and Davion's families, trying to make sense of how any of this happened in the first place. And honestly, part of why this case exploded the way it did is because people saw themselves in pieces of it. Not the crash, obviously, but the emotions, the toxic relationships, the impulsive decisions teenagers make, the dramatic fights, the breakups that feel world-ending when you're young. And that's what makes this case so disturbing, because it forces people to ask themselves one horrifying question. How far can emotional instability escalate before it becomes deadly? Now, when Netflix released the Crash documentary, public interest reignited all over again. Suddenly, people who had never even heard of McKenzie Shirilla were discovering the case and forming opinions overnight. And documentaries always influence perception in some ways. Always. Because no matter how balanced somebody tries to be, editing matters. Music matters. What clips are included matters. Which interviews get highlighted matters. The order information is presented matters. Everybody shapes how viewers emotionally process the story. Some people watched the documentary and became more convinced than ever that McKenzie intentionally killed Dominic and Davion. Others watched it and thought prosecutors relied too heavily on interpretation instead of undeniable proof. Because here's the thing, there was no confession, no text message saying I'm going to kill him tonight, no suicide note, no direct statement admitting intent afterwards. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Now, before everybody freaks out, circumstantial evidence absolutely can convict people. It happens constantly. DNA is technically circumstantial evidence. Fingerprints are circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial doesn't mean weak. But psychologically, many people will struggle with murder convictions when there isn't some giant obvious smoking gun moment. Instead, prosecutors built a puzzle. The threats, the speed, the lack of braking, the relationship volatility, the chosen route, the prior visit to the crash area, the accelerator fully being pressed down, the social media afterwards. Separately, maybe each thing has an alternative explanation, But together, prosecutors argued that they told one clear story: intentional murder. And honestly, the judge clearly agreed. One thing that people continue debating constantly is whether McKenzie truly understood the consequences of her actions in that moment. Because some psychologists and legal experts have pointed out something important about adolescents' brains. Teenagers process emotions differently than adults. Impulsivity is higher, risk assessment is weaker, emotional regulation is still developing, which is exactly why teenagers sometimes do incredibly reckless things without fully grasping outcomes. This argument became huge online because many people believe McKenzie acted impulsively rather than methodically. Like, maybe she wanted to scare Dominic, maybe she wanted attention, maybe she wanted emotional control, maybe she wanted everybody to panic, but not necessarily death. And honestly, that possibility terrifies people too, because it means a split-second emotional decision destroyed multiple lives forever. Now, on the opposite side, critics argue the evidence shows far more than impulsive recklessness. They point to the route through the industrial area, the acceleration continuing for several seconds, the complete absence of braking, the previous threats about crashing cars during fights, and they argue that all of that demonstrates purposeful action, not temporary panic. One especially disturbing detail people continue discussing is how isolated the crash location was. Prosecutors believe that McKenzie intentionally chose that route where fewer witnesses or drivers would be present that early in the morning. The judge even referenced that during sentencing, which honestly made the case feel even darker to many people, because if true, that suggests planning, not impulse. Then there's another major layer to this whole thing: survivor psychology. Because regardless of what anybody believes about intent, McKenzie survived a crash that killed 2 people sitting beside her. And survivor psychology after traumatic events can become extremely complicated. Some survivors become numb emotionally, some dissociate completely, some behave strangely because their brains are overwhelmed by guilt and trauma. Others become defensive because accepting responsibility psychologically destroys them. And honestly, people online rarely leave room for complexity like that. The internet usually wants heroes and villains, good people, bad people, simple answers, but real life is messy. Now, with that being said, even people trying to see nuance often struggle with some of McKenzie's behavior afterwards, especially the social media content, because perception matters whether it's fair or not. And unfortunately for McKenzie, many people viewed her post as insensitive at best and narcissistic at worst. Then the jail calls added another layer, particularly the parts where she focused heavily on herself being victimized by the legal process. Again, trauma responses varied, but public sympathy often disappears quickly when people perceive self-centeredness after tragedy. And that's exactly what happened here. Meanwhile, Dominic and Davion became almost symbolic online in a way. People constantly posted photos of them smiling, laughing, living normal young lives before everything happened. Friends shared stories about them, memorial pages stayed active, family interviews circulated repeatedly, and the grief surrounding them felt incredibly raw even years later, especially for Davion's family, because many people strongly believe that he was simply caught in somebody else's emotional storm. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong car. And honestly, that possibility hurts deeply to think about. Now, another thing that kept fueling debate was the issue of memory loss. McKenzie consistently claimed that she didn't remember the crash itself. Critics accused her of lying. Supporters argued that traumatic brain injuries absolutely can erase memories before and during catastrophic events, which is true. Memory after trauma is weird. Brains sometimes protect people by fragmenting events entirely. There are crash survivors who remember nothing. There are assault survivors who lose hours mentally. There are trauma victims whose brains literally stop recording properly during overwhelming stress. So medically speaking, memory loss itself was never impossible. The real issue became that whether people believe her overall story. Honestly, once public trust disappears, everything somebody says afterwards gets questioned too, even potentially truthful things. Now, something else that fascinated people about this case was the family dynamic surrounding McKenzie. Critics often accused her parents, especially her mother, of enabling her behavior and refusing accountability. Supporters argued that they were simply doing what any parent would do, defending their child. And honestly, both can probably be true simultaneously. Most parents would fight for their child no matter what, even when the evidence looks terrible, especially when the evidence looks terrible. Because parental love isn't always logical. But the courtroom statement and interviews definitely shaped public perception in powerful ways. A lot of people felt that McKenzie's mother focused too heavily on protecting her daughter's image instead of acknowledging the devastation suffered by the victims' families. Whether that's fair or not, it became a recurring criticism constantly repeated online. Then there's the parole question. Because McKenzie becomes eligible for parole eventually, and people argue about what should happen if that day comes. Some believe she deserves another chance someday because she was a teenager at the time. Others believe intentional actions leading to 2 deaths should keep her in prison permanently. And honestly, parole boards heavily consider remorse, accountability, behavior in prison, rehabilitation efforts, and acceptance of responsibility. Which means how McKenzie continues handling this case publicly could matter enormously later. Because one thing became very clear throughout all of this. People aren't only judging the crash itself, they're judging everything afterwards too. The statements, the interviews, the calls, the reactions, the attitude, all of it. And in cases involving emotional and public outrage, perception sometimes becomes almost as powerful as evidence itself. Now, next time we're finishing the deep dive by breaking down the biggest unanswered question and competing theories about what happened inside that car and why this case may never stop dividing people completely. So after everything, the trial, the conviction, the sentencing, the interviews, the documentaries, the internet wars, the jail calls, people are still arguing about one central question. What actually happened inside that car during those final seconds? Because that's the thing about this case. Nobody truly knows except the 3 people who were inside the vehicle that morning, and 2 of them can never speak again, which leaves everybody else trying to reconstruct intent from evidence, behavior, psychology, and circumstances. And honestly, depending on which pieces you prioritize, you can end up with very different conclusions. So let's break down the biggest theories people continue debating. Theory number 1 is intentional murder. This is obviously the prosecution's theory and the one accepted by the judge. According to this version of events, McKenzie became emotionally overwhelmed over her relationship with Dominic Russo, and maybe she feared losing him permanently. Maybe an argument happened inside the vehicle that night. Maybe something triggered her emotionally during the drive. Then once she turned onto Alameda Drive, she made a conscious decision. Accelerate, do not brake, and everything. Prosecutors argued the evidence strongly supported this. You have the prior threats about crashing cars during arguments. You have the chosen isolated route, the speed. You have the lack of braking, the steering behavior, the previous visit of the area days before. I don't know why I'm messing up my words. I'm sorry about that. To supporters of this theory, the evidence paints a disturbingly clear picture. They believe McKenzie intentionally used the vehicle as a weapon. And honestly, the judge's language during sentencing reflected exactly that belief. She repeatedly emphasized purpose, control, planning, and deliberate decision-making. Now, theory number 2 was a reckless emotional impulsivity without actual intent to kill. This theory is interesting because a lot of people fall somewhere here. Basically, they believe that McKenzie drove recklessly and emotionally during an argument or emotional breakdown, but never genuinely intended for anyone to die. Maybe she wanted to scare Dominic. Maybe she wanted attention. Maybe she wanted to create panic. Maybe she felt emotionally out of control and acted dangerously without fully processing consequences. Supporters of this theory often point towards adolescent brain development and emotional immaturity. They argue that teenagers sometimes engage in reckless behaviors that adults cannot even comprehend logically afterwards. And honestly, that's true. Teenagers sometimes genuinely believe terrible outcomes won't actually happen until suddenly they do, which honestly makes this theory emotionally unbelievable to many people. However, critics of this theory point to one major issue: 100 miles per hour. Because once you reach that kind of speed on a regular road, many people argue death becomes an obvious and unavoidable outcome, meaning intent can reasonably be inferred from the behavior itself. Then there's theory number 3, the medical episode theory. According to this version, McKenzie experienced some kind of blackout or fainting episode related to POTS or another medical issue while driving. Supporters point to her history of dizziness and fainting episodes. They also point towards her repeated claims that she remembered turning onto the road before everything suddenly went black. And honestly, medically speaking, blackouts absolutely happen. People faint behind the wheel sometimes. Medical emergencies while driving are real. But prosecutors strongly rejected this theory for several reasons. Again, they emphasized the accelerator being fully pressed down, the steering was adjusted, the lack of evidence proving any active medical event occurred, and they argued that the driving pattern appeared controlled rather than unconscious. Which brings us to theory number 4, passenger interference. Some people believe Dominic, or possibly even Davion, grabbed the wheel during an argument or moment of panic, contributing to the crash. Remember those text messages introduced later where McKenzie claimed that Dominic previously grabbed her steering wheel during a fight? Supporters of this theory argue that that demonstrates precedent for chaotic physical conflict inside vehicles. Maybe an argument escalated, maybe somebody panicked, maybe there was struggle, maybe everything spiraled within seconds. Now, crash analysts acknowledged steering movements shortly before impact, but prosecutors maintained that there was insufficient evidence proving another passenger caused the crash. Still though, because only one person survived, theories about what happened inside the vehicle continue endlessly. And honestly, they probably always will. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable for just a second. Public perception of young women in crime cases. Because whether people realize it or not, gender absolutely influences how cases like this can get discussed online. Some people viewed McKenzie through the lens of crazy toxic girlfriend stereotypes almost immediately. Others believe her appearance, age, and social media presence influence both media attention and public outrage dramatically. And honestly, there's truth to that too. Cases involving attractive young defendants often explode differently online. People become emotionally invested in ways that sometimes don't without other cases. Then social media amplifies everything further because suddenly everybody feels personally involved despite her never knowing anyone connected to the relationship. And once TikTok gets a hold of this case, forget it. Everybody becomes a detective overnight. People analyze facial expressions frame by frame, voice tones, Instagram captions, body language, everything, which creates another issue entirely. Confirmation bias. People tend to notice evidence supporting whatever they already believe while dismissing conflicting details. If somebody believes McKenzie intentionally killed Dominic, every social media post afterwards looks cold and narcissistic. If somebody believes that she survived a tragic accident and became unfairly demonized, those same posts might look like trauma responses from an emotionally immature teenager. Perspective changes interpretation constantly. And honestly, that's part of why this case became such a lightning rod online. Now, another uncomfortable question people continue asking is this: did McKenzie actually feel remorse? And listen, nobody except McKenzie truly knows how she feels internally, but public perception of remorse matters enormously, especially in criminal cases. Critics argue that genuine remorse would involve full accountability, empathy centered primarily on the victims, and less focus on personal suffering. Supporters argue that trauma can make people appear emotionally disconnected or self-focused while psychologically drowning internally. Again, both things can happen. Human beings are complicated, especially after catastrophic trauma. But unfortunately, public opinion rarely leaves room for complicated. And the more recordings, interviews, and statements emerged, the more entrenched people became in their existing beliefs about her character. Now, one thing I keep thinking about throughout this case is how young everybody was. Dominic was 20, Davion was 19, McKenzie was 17. That's it. Babies, honestly. And I know us teenagers hate being called babies, but your entire life at that age still exists mostly as potential careers, potential families, potential futures, potential mistakes that you haven't yet made. Then suddenly one moment changes everything permanently. That's part of what makes this case feel so haunting. Not just because people died, but because everything about it feels avoidable somehow. The toxic relationship, the reckless choices, the emotional volatility, the speeding, the drugs, the late night driving, all of it. It feels like watching warning signs stack higher and higher until finally something catastrophic happened. And honestly, I think that's another reason that this case sticks with people so intensely. It feels frighteningly human. Not in a relatable murder way, obviously, but in a people lose emotional control sometimes way. Or in a young relationships can become dangerously consuming type of way. Or in a one terrible decision that can destroy countless lives forever way. That reality scares people because it feels close enough to reality rather than some distant monster story. No serial killer mastermind, no elaborate criminal conspiracy, just emotional chaos, impulsivity, recklessness, and tragedy colliding together in the worst possible way. In this next part, and the last final part, we're going to wrap up this entire deep dive with the lasting impact of the case, where things stand now, and the biggest question people still cannot stop asking themselves after everything. accident, recklessness, or intentional murder. So here we are, after all the evidence, all the arguments, all the courtroom footage, all the interviews, the documentaries, the jail calls, the social media debates, and honestly one of the most emotionally devised true crime cases in recent history, we still end up circling back to the exact same question. What really happened on Alameda Drive that morning? Because legally, the case is decided. The judge found McKenzie Shirilla guilty of intentionally murdering Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. That part is no longer a debate inside the court system. But in the public eye, people are still split almost right down the middle. And honestly, I think part of why this case lingers in people's minds is because there's no emotionally satisfying ending. There isn't one. No matter what you believe happened, the outcome is horrifying. If you believe that it was intentional, 2 young men lost their lives because of one person's emotional instability and rage. If you believe it was reckless impulsivity, then 2 young men still lost their lives because somebody made catastrophic decisions without understanding the consequences. If you believe that it was a medical emergency, then everybody involved becomes a victim of a tragedy that nobody could stop. No version feels okay. No version feels fair. And maybe that's why people stay obsessed with this case years later. Because the human brain desperately wants things to make sense. We want clear answers. We want certainty. We want obvious villains and obvious truths. But life usually doesn't work like that. Now, where things stand currently, McKenzie remains incarcerated and will eventually become eligible for parole in the future. Whether she ever gets released early is another conversation entirely, because parole boards evaluate a lot more than simply time served. They look at accountability, they look at behavior, rehabilitation, acceptance of responsibility, remorse, growth. And honestly, that's where this case becomes especially complicated, because throughout this entire process, many people feel McKenzie has never fully accepted responsibility in a way that they expected. Some people wanted to hear direct acknowledgement, something stronger, something clearer. Instead, much of the public conversation surrounding her focused on alternate explanations, medical episodes, steering wheel theories, procedural arguments, appeals. And for many people, that reinforced the idea that she still sees primarily herself as the victim. Now, whether that's actually true internally, nobody knows, but perception matters, especially in cases involving violent deaths. And unfortunately for McKenzie, public perception of her became overwhelmingly negative very quick and never really recovered. Meanwhile, Dominic and Davion's families continue living with unimaginable grief every single day. And honestly, that's the part I think sometimes gets lost once internet debates take over, because social media turns real tragedies into arguments. Teams, opinions, content. People start debating evidence like it's a television show instead of remembering the 2 actual human beings died violently. Davion never got to open his barbershop, and Dominic never got to continue building his business and future. Their families never got normal lives back. Every birthday, every holiday, every graduation, every family gathering, everything now exists with missing pieces forever. And no legal outcome changes that. One thing I personally keep thinking about in this case is how many warning signs seem to exist before the crash. Not necessarily warning signs for murder specifically, but warning signs for emotional volatility, instability, toxicity, and dangerous behavior. You have the threats, the explosive fights, the emotional dependence, the reckless driving behavior, the intensity of the relationship. And honestly, I think that there's a larger conversation here that goes beyond this individual case, because people normalize toxic relationship behavior constantly when they're young. Threatening to crash cars, destroying property during fights, manipulation, obsessive attachment, aggressive arguments. People laugh it off and sometimes as young love or being dramatic, but emotional instability mixed with impulsivity can become genuinely dangerous. Now, something else that sticks with me is the idea of survivorship itself, because surviving when others die beside you creates its own kind of psychological prison regardless of fault. Even if it had been purely accidental, McKenzie still would have spent the rest of her life knowing that 2 people died while she survived. That alone destroys people emotionally sometimes. Then add public hatred, prison, nationwide media attention, and the murder convictions on top of that, it becomes almost impossible to even comprehend psychologically. Again though, none of that changes that Dominic and Davion's families lost. And I think that tension is exactly why this case remains so emotionally explosive. People can hold empathy for trauma while still believing accountability matters. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Now, if there's one thing this case should probably remind everybody, it's this. Cars are not harmless emotional outlets. And I know that sounds obvious, but people drive angry constantly. People speed during fights. People use vehicles to intimidate, scare, control, threaten, and emotionally react all of the time without considering how quickly things become deadly. A car moving 100 miles per hour stops being transportation and becomes violence, whether intentional or not. And unfortunately, it only takes a few seconds for lives to disappear permanently. So, where do I land personally after everything? I think the relationship was deeply toxic. I think that there was emotional instability on multiple sides. I think that there were warning signs long before the crash. And I think that the evidence supporting intentionality is strong enough that I understand exactly why the judge convicted her the way she did. But I also think that the entire case is profoundly tragic no matter how you interpret it. 3 young lives were destroyed. Multiple families were shattered. One horrifying and morning-changing history forever for everybody connected to it. And honestly, that's probably the hardest part about true crime stories sometimes. Not a mystery, not the evidence, not the courtroom drama. It was realizing how quickly ordinary human chaos can turn irreversible. And that's the case of McKenzie Shirilla. And now I want to know what you think. Do you think it was an accident? Do you think it was recklessness? Do you think it was intentional murder? Because clearly, years later, the world still cannot agree. Cases like this are always difficult because no matter what you believe happened that night, the outcome is devastating. 2 young men lost their lives. Multiple families were destroyed forever, and one decision changed everything in a matter of seconds. I want to know your thoughts. Do you believe that it was intentional? Do you think that it was a reckless behavior that spiraled out of control? Or do you believe that there's still reasonable doubt about what really happened inside that car? Let me know your thoughts below. As always, be respectful to each other in the comments, take care of yourselves, and until next time, be nice, don't kill people, drive safe, and have a great day, evening, or night.